There is a place under Lake Huron where the water goes dark long before you reach the bottom, and when the lights of a survey vehicle finally catch the ridge, they land on a line of stones that has no business being straight. The stones run in a row across the drowned rock, spaced the way a person spaces things, narrowing at one end into a funnel and opening at the other into a killing ground. They sit more than 100 feet down, in cold that never changes, in a lake that carries more freight than almost any inland water on Earth. No shore culture anyone has named ever built on that spot, because by the time there were shore cultures, the spot was already under the lake, and yet someone laid those stones. Someone knelt on dry ground where there is now 100 feet of water and arranged rock into a shape that only makes sense if you were driving animals toward a waiting spear. The question that hangs over the Alpina Amberley Ridge is not whether the walls are real. They are real, and they are mapped, and they have been described in the pages of one of the most cautious scientific journals in the world. The question is who we are willing to say built them. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And what we are quietly unwilling to admit about the ground they stand on. Because the moment you say a wall on the floor of a great lake predates every culture on the shore above it, you have opened a door, and a certain kind of storyteller will walk straight through that door and start talking about a lost world, a drowned civilization, a chapter torn out of the record on purpose. That is the easy story. It is also the wrong one. The harder story, the one with receipts, is stranger, because it is true, and because almost nobody was hiding any of it. Start with what is actually down there. In the middle of Lake Huron, running from near Alpena on the Michigan side toward the Ontario shore near a town called Amberley, there is a spine of limestone bedrock. Today it is a submerged ridge, a shallow hump in a deep lake, favoured by fish and avoided by freighters. But the rock does not care that it is wet. It remembers being dry. And for a stretch of the early Holocene, thousands of years ago, it was dry, a long causeway of solid ground bridging what are now two countries, standing above a lake that had shrunk far below its modern level. The reason the lake shrank is not mysterious. When the last great ice sheet pulled back from the Great Lakes basin, it left behind an unfinished landscape. Meltwater filled some basins to the brim and drained others almost to the floor. The outlets shifted as the ice moved, and the land itself was rising, rebounding upward now that the unimaginable weight of a mile of ice had been lifted off it. Geologists call that rebound isostatic adjustment, and the northern rim of the Great Lakes is still doing it today, still creeping upward a fraction of an inch a year, still tilting the water in the basins like liquid in a slowly lifted tray. During one low phase, sometimes called Lake Stanley, the surface of what is now Lake Huron sat perhaps 120 feet below where it sits now. The ridge stood in the open air. A cold plain ran across the middle of the lake, and across that plain, twice a year, the caribou came. The lake itself has a history as dramatic as anything a hunter did on it. The basin that holds Lake Huron did not fill once and settle. It moved through a sequence of stages as the ice let go, each with its own shoreline and its own outlet, rising and falling by scores of feet as the drainage rearranged itself. There was a high stage that geologists call Lake Algonquin, when the water stood well above the modern level and left old beach lines stranded far inland where you can still trace them today. Then, as lower outlets opened toward the northeast and the crust kept rebounding, the upper lakes drained down into the deep low phase that exposed the ridge, the interval sometimes called Lake Stanley, when a person could walk from Michigan to Ontario across dry ground. And then the outlets shifted again. The water climbed back up through a stage called Lake Nipissing and closed over the plain for good. The drive lanes were built during the window when the causeway was open and the caribou were crossing it, and they were drowned when that window shut. The whole thing is a matter of a few thousand years of a lake breathing in and out, and the human structure is a single held breath somewhere inside it. That is the setting the archaeologists reconstructed, and it is the setting that makes the stones make sense. In 2009, A team led by John O'Shea and Guy Meadows out of the University of Michigan published an account of features they had located on the ridge using sonar and remotely operated vehicles. Lines of stone, arrangements of boulders that did not match the random scatter of glacial debris around them. Some ran in long straight lanes, some clustered into small enclosures a person could crouch behind. Later work on a feature they came to call the Drop 45 Drive. Lane described something even more deliberate, a V-shaped corridor of aligned stones with hunting blinds set exactly where an ambush would want them, the whole structure engineered to funnel a moving herd toward hidden hunters. It was not a wall in the sense of a fortification. It was a machine for killing caribou, built out of the only material that plain offered, and then abandoned to the rising water so gently that it was never knocked down. None of this was accepted on site, and it should not have been. A straight line of rocks on a lake floor is exactly the kind of thing a hopeful eye invents, and geology is perfectly capable of laying stones in rows without any help from people. Ice can drag boulders into low ridges. Ancient beaches can leave gravel bars that look purposeful. So the team did what careful people do. They mapped the features precisely, compared them against the random scatter of glacial cobbles nearby, and looked for the small human leavings that natural processes do not make. Divers recovered chipped stone, the little flakes that fall away when a person works a tool, lying near the structures where a hunter waiting in a blind might have sharpened a point or mended a shaft. They matched the geometry of the lanes against caribou drive systems still visible on land in the Arctic, where Inuit and their ancestors built stone rows and cairn lines and human-shaped stone figures to steer herds toward the kill. The comparison held. The Alpina Amberley features were not merely straight. They were straight in the specific way a hunting drive is straight, aligned to the ground and to the likely path of the animals, with blinds set exactly where a patient hunter would actually want to crouch. The argument over whether the lines were natural was real, and it was healthy, and the evidence answered it. That kind of argument, carried out in the open, is the opposite of a cover-up. It is how a genuine claim earns its place. It is worth sitting for a moment with what a drive lane implies about the people who built it, because the implication is the opposite of primitive. A drive is not a lucky ambush. It is a plan that needs many hands, shared knowledge of where the caribou will pass and when, agreement on who stands where, and the patience to build stone architecture across open ground for a payoff that comes only when the herd cooperates. It implies a calendar kept in memory, a division of labour, and a way of storing and sharing a sudden glut of meat before it spoils. The caribou of that cold plain moved in seasonal rhythm, north in one part of the year and south in another, funneling naturally onto the ridge because the ridge was the dry road across a widening lake. The hunters read that geography and built into it. They turned a landform into an instrument. That is engineering in every sense that matters, done 90 centuries ago, by people the easy story would rather leave a blank. Here is where the honest account and the seductive account split apart. The seductive account fixes on that phrase, predates any known culture on the shore, and treats it as an admission of ignorance so total that anything might fill the gap. If we do not know who built it, the reasoning goes, then perhaps it was someone grand, someone advanced, someone the textbooks refuse to name. This is the same instinct that once looked at the earthen mounds of the Ohio Valley and insisted they were too sophisticated for the ancestors of living native people, that they must have been raised by Phoenicians or lost Israelites or vanished giants. It is a very old reflex, and it has a very specific function. It empties the land of its actual builders so that the land can be claimed by someone else. The people who built the drive lanes on the Alpina Amberley Ridge are not unknown. They are unnamed in the narrow sense that we do not have their word for themselves, because they left no writing and their descendants were not asked in time. But they are not a mystery species. They were early hunters of the post-glacial Great Lakes, ancestors of the peoples who were living all around that lake when the first European ships arrived, the Anishinaabe nations, the Ojibwe and the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, who called themselves the Council of Three Fires. Caribou drive hunting of exactly this kind is documented across the northern world, in the Arctic, in Scandinavia, among peoples who built stone lanes and cairn lines and brush fences to steer herds for as long as anyone has watched them do it. The structure on the ridge is not evidence of a lost civilization. It is evidence of a very old and very well understood way of feeding a community, practiced on ground that happens to now be underwater. The only thing that vanished was the plain. The people walked north with the retreating cold and the retreating caribou, and their line did not end. It is standing on the shore right now. So why does the ridge feel like a secret? Part of the answer is the water itself. Water is the load-bearing beam of every drowned world theory, because water hides things cheaply and completely, and because a flood is the one reset that every culture on Earth already has a story about. When you tell someone there is a structure under 100 feet of lake, their imagination does the rest. But the water on the Alpina Amberley Ridge did not rush in to bury a wickedness. It rose slowly, over centuries, as the outlets of the upper Great Lakes shifted and the basins refilled, and the rebounding land tilted the whole system. The drive lanes were not drowned in an afternoon. They were surrendered, season by season, as the shoreline crept up the ridge, and the caribou route moved and the hunters moved with it. What the depth preserved is not a crime. It is a floor plan. And that floor plan survived for a reason that is almost boring. The deep water of Lake Huron is cold and dark, and low in the churning energy that destroys things near a shoreline. There are no waves down there to roll the stones, no roots to pry them, no frost to heave them, no farmer to clear them, no developer to pour over them. On land, a 9,000-year-old arrangement of unmortared boulders would have been scattered 100 times over by now. Under the lake it sat untouched, because the lake is a better archivist than the land ever was. That is the quiet irony at the center of this whole story. The reason we can still read the oldest human structure in the region is that it fell into the one place in the region no one could reach to disturb it or to sell it. Think about what would have happened to those stones on land. A structure that old, made of loose boulders, sitting on an open plain, would have been pulled apart 1,000 times over by 90 centuries of weather and roots and frost and people. Farmers clear stone from fields as a first act of ownership. Almost every ancient surface structure in a settled country has been robbed or ploughed or repurposed, its meaning scattered before anyone thought to record it. The ridge escaped all of that for one reason. It was unreachable. No plough, no collector, no developer, and for most of history no archaeologist could get to it. The depth that makes it feel like a secret is the same depth that kept it honest. It is one of the only human structures of its age anywhere that no later hand has rearranged, and it stayed intact precisely because it was, until very recently, impossible to reach and impossible to sell. Now bring in the money, because in this lake the money is never far from the rock. Stand on the Michigan shore nearest the ridge, and you are standing in one of the great extraction landscapes of North America, and the thing being extracted is the same stone the caribou hunters walked on. This corner of Lake Huron is limestone country. The bedrock that forms the ridge is part of a vast sheet of ancient carbonate, laid down in a warm, shallow sea hundreds of millions of years before there was a lake or a hunter or a caribou, and that carbonate is one of the most quietly valuable substances in the industrial world. Up the shore at Rogers City sits the calcite quarry, for generations described as the largest limestone quarry on the planet, a hole in the ground so big it has its own harbour, its own fleet, its own weather. The company that opened it, Michigan Limestone and Chemical, did not just dig rock, it rebuilt the way rock moves. Because limestone is the skeleton of the modern economy. Crush it and roast it and you get lime and cement, the grey powder that becomes the sidewalk and the foundation and the dam and the runway. Feed it to a blast furnace as flux, and it pulls the impurities out of iron so that iron can become steel. Every skyline you have ever admired is standing on burned limestone, and a great deal of the limestone that built the American Midwest came out of this shore of this lake and went out across this water. To move it cheaply, the quarry operators pioneered the self-unloading lake freighter, a ship that could empty its own belly of stone with conveyors and booms, instead of waiting on a crew of men with shovels and a dock full of machinery. The vessels of the Bradley fleet ran limestone out of Rogers City for decades, and the town lived and died by that stone. When the freighter Carl D. Bradley broke apart and sank in a Lake Michigan storm in 1958, most of the men who drowned were from Rogers City, and a single small town buried most of a ship's crew at once. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now. because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The lake that preserved the drive lanes so gently is the same lake that takes the men who quarry the drive lanes bedrock. It keeps some things and it swallows others, and it keeps no ledger of the difference. Down the shore at Alpena, the same rock becomes cement on an industrial scale in one of the largest cement plants in the world, a plant that has been feeding the grey powder into the American economy for more than a century. So consider the full shape of it. 9,000 years ago, human beings arranged this limestone by hand into a structure for survival, then let the water take it. Today, corporations arrange the same limestone by the millions of tons into structures for profit and ship it out over the very water that covers the older work. The ancient wall and the modern quarry are cut from one bed of stone. One was a way to eat. The other is a way to build, and only one of them shows up on a balance sheet. Limestone is only the most obvious wealth this lake gave up. Before the quarries there were the forests, and the story of the Michigan shore in the 19th century is the story of the fastest liquidation of standing timber the continent had ever seen. The white pine of the Saginaw country and the northern lower peninsula was cut and floated and milled into the lumber that built Chicago and the treeless prairie towns beyond it. And when the pine was gone, the lumbermen simply left, having turned a forest that took centuries to grow into a single generation of fortunes. Under the ground there was salt, vast beds of it left behind by the same ancient seas that made the limestone, mined beneath Detroit and pumped up along the shore, because the region that became a centre of the chemical industry sat on a buried ocean of brine. There was gypsum for plaster, there was the fishery itself, the whitefish and the lake trout that fed the shore communities, and then fed a commercial industry that stripped them faster than they could return. And when an invader called the sea lamprey came up through the improved shipping channels in the 20th century and fastened onto what was left, the great native lake trout of Huron collapsed almost to nothing, a fishery worth generations of livelihood undone in a couple of decades. The lake gave timber, salt, stone, and fish, and each was taken the same way, all at once, as though the taking could never end. The fish carry the deeper story too, because the right to catch them is one of the few places where the older economy of this lake was written back into law. When the Anishinaabe nations ceded their lands in the treaties of the 1800s, some of them kept, in writing, the right to fish the waters they had always fished. For a long time those promises were ignored, and native fishermen were arrested for exercising rights their ancestors had never surrendered. It took modern lawsuits, running late into the 20th century, to force the courts to admit that a treaty is a contract and that the fishing right was real and still owned. The result was a set of hard-won agreements dividing the Great Lakes catch, an acknowledgement on paper that the people who once hunted the drowned plain never actually left the lake. That is the same continuity the drive lanes show, carried in a different medium. The stone says they were here first, the treaty says they are here still, and both were resisted by the same reflex that prefers the builders to be safely and conveniently lost. The water covering the ridge is not simply a fact of nature either, and this is where the story turns from geology into accounting. The Great Lakes look wild, but their level is, to a meaningful degree, a managed number, a figure that engineers and treaties and lawsuits have been adjusting for more than a century. At the far end of the system, the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal was cut around 1900 to reverse the Chicago River and flush the city's sewage away from its drinking water, and in doing so it began drawing water permanently out of Lake Michigan and down toward the Mississippi. Wisconsin and other states sued over the diversion, and the Supreme Court spent years fixing how much water Chicago was allowed to steal from the lakes, because a few inches of lake level is worth a fortune in shipping depth and shoreline property. At the outlet of Lake Huron itself, the street, Clare River has been dredged again and again to let bigger freighters pass, and a controversial study commissioned by shoreline residents argued that the dredging had turned the river into something like an open drain, quietly lowering the level of Lakes Michigan and Huron and never letting it fully recover. International boards studied the claim, argued over it, and proposed structures to put water back. Whatever the final verdict, the point stands. The height of the water over the Alpina Amberley Ridge is partly an engineering decision. The lake sits where a century of dredging and diversion and compensation has left it. The archive was sealed by nature, but the depth of the seal is now, in part, a policy. The scale of the engineering on this water is easy to underestimate from the shore, where the lake looks eternal. But in 1959 the whole system was remade when the St. Lawrence Seaway opened a deepened path from the Atlantic all the way to the head of the lakes, so that ocean-going ships could sail into the middle of the continent. Locks were built, channels were cut, whole rapids were drowned, and the level of the connected lakes became something that a chain of dams and diversions and compensation works helped to hold within a usable range. A Great Lake is not a pond that fills with rain and empties in the sun and does as it pleases. It is the largest managed freshwater system on the planet, tuned for the passage of freight, and the number that describes its surface in any given year is the outcome of rain and snow and rebounding crust, and also of decisions made in offices about how much water to release and where. The plain that the Caribou crossed lies under a lake we have spent a century learning to operate, and the water is not just held at a level, it is charted, and a chart is a price. From the 1840s, the United States ran a lake survey out of the Army Corps of Engineers, sounding the depths, mapping the shoals, marking the ridges, because a great lake is not a wilderness to the men who move iron across it. It is a highway, and every highway needs a map, and every map is really a schedule of what can pass and what cannot, and how much it will cost. The ore that built America came down this way, iron out of the Lake Superior ranges near Marquette and out on the Mesabi, through the locks at Salt Sweet, Marie, across the open water of Huron, down to the furnaces of the lower lakes, where it met the limestone flux and became steel. The Alpina Amberley Ridge sits under one of the busiest freshwater shipping corridors on the planet, and the same surveys that keep the freighters off the shallow rock are the surveys that first let anyone suspect there was worked stone on it. The instrument that priced the lane is the instrument that found the wall. There is one more layer, and it is the sharpest one, because it is about which drowned things we agree to value. Off Alpina, in the water above and around the ridge, lies a graveyard of shipwrecks, and in the year 2000 that graveyard was made, the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, a federally protected preserve managed by the National Ocean Agency, wrapped in law, studied, dived, filmed, and turned into a heritage economy that draws visitors to a small city that needed them. A wooden schooner that sank in a storm 150 years ago is now an asset. It has a name, a date, a story, a mooring buoy, a protective statute, and a gift shop within reach. It is worth money precisely because it is old and underwater and can be sold as a memory. The stretch of Huron off Alpina earned a grim nickname across the whole era of Great Lakes commerce. Sailors called it Shipwreck Alley, because the shoals and the sudden storms and the fog took ship after ship there, and the cold fresh water kept them so completely that divers today find wrecks with masts still standing and wheels still in place, better preserved than almost anything on the salt oceans. Something over 100 known wrecks lie within the sanctuary boundaries, and more are still being located. The same physics that holds a schooner intact under the lake for a century and a half is the physics that held the drive lanes intact for 9 millennia. Cold, dark, fresh, and still. The lake is not choosy about what it saves. It preserves the freighter and the hunting blind with exactly the same patience. We are the ones who decide which saved thing gets a statute and which gets a warning label. Now set that beside the drive lanes. The stone structures on the ridge are 5 or 6 times older than the oldest shipwreck in the sanctuary. They represent something no ship does, the actual survival of an actual people on ground that no longer exists. And they have almost no market at all. There is no admission charge to a caribou blind. There is no salvage claim on a 9,000-year-old hunting lane. A pre-contact site drowned in a Great Lake generates papers and permits and careful academic caution, and it generates very little else because the machinery that turns underwater objects into cash was built for wrecks and treasure, not for the quiet engineering of hunters. The same water holds both. One is a business, the other is a footnote. The difference between them is not age, and it is not importance. The difference is that one fits the ledger and one does not. That asymmetry is the real buried thing here, and it is not buried under the lake. It is buried in the way we assign worth. The law that protects a sunken steamer took decades to fight into existence. The law that protects the graves and belongings of native ancestors, the Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, took far longer and is still resisted, and it exists because, for a century, institutions treated indigenous remains and indigenous objects as specimens and inventory, rather than as people and property. The drive lanes on the ridge belong, by every honest reading, to the ancestors of nations that are still here, still governing, still fishing this lake under treaties their leaders signed as the land was taken out from under them, the cessions of the 1800s that transferred Michigan from the Council of Three Fires to the United States, acre by acre and dollar by dollar. The ridge was dry when their ancestors hunted it. It was seeded when their descendants were made to sign. And it was found, at last, not by the people who lost it, but by a sonar rig mapping a shipping hazard. So, what do we actually have? We have a set of stone structures on the floor of Lake Huron, real, mapped, published, and about 9,000 years old. We have a plain, honest explanation for every part of the mystery. The stones are straight because people made them straight to steer caribou. The site is underwater because the post-glacial lake slowly rose and the rebounding land tilted the basin. The structure survived because deep, cold, fresh water is the best preservative in the region. And the builders are not a lost race, but the ancestors of living nations, doing a thing that hunters have done in cold country for as long as there have been hunters. Nothing was hidden. The work was announced in a journal, discussed at conferences, covered in the press. The phrase that makes it feel like a conspiracy, predates any known culture on the shore, is technically true and profoundly misleading, because it counts only the cultures that stayed to build towns on the beach and ignores the ones that were already walking the plain before the beach was a beach. What is genuinely uncomfortable is not a secret at all. It is the ordinariness. It is that the oldest human structure in the heart of the continent survived only because it fell into the one place too deep to quarry, in a lake whose level we now set with dredges and treaties, along a lane we chart so that freighters full of the same limestone can pass over the heads of the hunters who first shaped it. It is that a schooner is an asset and a 9,000-year-old survival machine is a footnote. It is that the reflex to call the builders lost is the same reflex that made it easy to take the shore they came from. The walls under Lake Huron do not prove a vanished civilization. They prove a present one, and they prove how cheaply we agree to forget it. Go and look, if you are anywhere near that shore. Stand at Alpena and watch a self-unloader ride low with cement out toward the shipping lane. Drive up to Rogers City and look down into the quarry that ate a mountain of the same stone. Find the gauge that records the level of the lake and read the number that a century of engineering has settled on. And then remember that 100 feet under the freighters, in the cold and the dark, a line of hand-set boulders is still pointing the way a herd was meant to run, laid down by people who were never lost, on a plain that was, over ground we quarried, under water we hold in place. Make of that what you will.